In the gleaming towers of San Francisco's tech district, a brilliant systems architect was about to face corporate betrayal. What started as a routine system rescue at 2 a.m. took a shocking turn when they came face to face with their own replacement. Rebecca Harper wasn't your typical tech employee. For 5 years, she had spent her life building InnovateTech's entire digital infrastructure from scratch, known for her methodical brilliance and unwavering dedication. When she encountered her former intern Jake Morrison taking over her role, at half her salary, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would expose systematic discrimination across Silicon Valley. Harper's calculated response would lead to a corporate reckoning that transformed an entire industry's approach to valuing expertise over politics. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blue glow of multiple monitors cast harsh shadows across Becca Harper's face as her fingers flew across the keyboard, each keystroke deliberate and purposeful. At 2:17 a.m., the InnovateTech office was a tomb of silence, broken only by the hum of servers and the occasional click of her mouse. The emergency alert had jolted her from sleep 43 minutes ago, a cascading failure in the primary database cluster that threatened to bring down every client system they managed. "Come on," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging. Slightly in the over-air-conditioned server room, the monitoring dashboard painted a grim picture. 3 database nodes offline, transaction logs corrupting, and backup systems struggling under the unexpected load. To anyone else, it would have looked like digital chaos. To Becca, it was a puzzle with exactly one solution, and she was the only person at InnovateTech who knew how to find it. Her Wisconsin pragmatism had served her well during these late-night crises. While other architects might panic or call in expensive external support, Becca approached each problem with the methodical patience her father had taught her when fixing farm equipment back in Eau Claire. Every system had its logic, its patterns, its tells. You just had to listen carefully enough to hear what it was trying to tell you. The root cause became clear as she traced through the error logs. A memory leak in the custom indexing module she'd written 3 years ago. Now, finally, revealing itself under the stress of their largest client's data migration. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was fixing a problem in code that only she fully understood, written during one of many unpaid overtime sessions when the company was desperate to land the Morrison Industries contract. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, implementing a temporary fix that would hold until morning while she crafted a permanent solution. The monitoring graphs slowly shifted from angry red to cautious yellow, then finally to the reassuring green that meant another disaster averted. By 3:02 a.m., she had saved InnovateTech approximately $2, $3 million in potential penalties and lost revenue. She documented the incident in their tracking system with characteristic thoroughness, noting the temporary nature of her fix and the steps needed for permanent resolution. Someone else might have waited until morning, claimed credit. In a team meeting, perhaps suggested the need for additional resources. Becca simply marked the ticket as resolved and began planning how to prevent similar issues in the future. The walk to her car through the empty parking garage felt surreal after the intensity of the crisis. San Francisco's typical morning fog was already beginning to roll in from the bay, creating ghostly halos around the streetlights. She'd grab 3 hours of sleep and be back at her desk by 8, ready to implement the permanent fix before anyone else even realized there had been a problem. The coffee hadn't had time to work its magic when Amanda Phillips appeared at Becca's cubicle the next morning, her usually warm smile replaced by something that looked almost apologetic. "Becca? Richard would like to see you in his office when you have a moment." The tone was wrong, too formal, too careful. Amanda had been InnovateTech's HR director for 15 years, long enough to develop an easy rapport with most employees. This version of Amanda, the one speaking in corporate euphemisms, only appeared during layoffs or disciplinary actions. "Sure," Becca replied, noting how Amanda's eyes didn't quite meet hers. Now works fine. The walk to Richard Blackwood's corner office felt longer than usual, past the motivational posters about innovation and teamwork that had appeared shortly after his arrival 2 years ago. Becca had always found them performative, corporate theater, designed to paper over the gradual erosion of the company culture that Marcus Thompson had built. Blackwood's office was a shrine to aggressive capitalism, awards from his Wall Street days, expensive art that probably cost more than most employees' annual salaries, and a view of the bay that he'd claimed immediately upon his arrival. He stood, with his back to them as they entered, hands clasped behind him in a pose she'd seen him practice for board presentations. "Rebecca, please, sit down." He turned with the smile that had probably charmed countless investors and acquisition targets. "Amanda, thank you for joining us." The fact that Amanda was present confirmed Becca's growing suspicion. HR only attended termination meetings and major disciplinary actions. Given that she'd just saved the company millions of dollars 12 hours ago, she doubted this was about her performance. "I'll get straight to the point," Blackwood continued, settling behind his mahogany desk. "As part of our ongoing operational optimization, we've made the difficult decision to restructure the systems architecture role." Becca's analytical mind immediately began parsing the corporate speak. Operational optimization meant cost-cutting. Difficult decision meant they'd already made up their minds. Restructure was just a euphemism for elimination. "We've been impressed with Jake Morrison's development during his internship," Blackwood continued, apparently oblivious to the way Amanda had gone rigid in her chair. His fresh perspective and enthusiasm, combined with his strong educational background, make him an ideal candidate to take over the technical operations role at a compensation level more aligned with current market realities. The words hit, like physical blows. Jake Morrison, the Stanford graduate who'd spent 6 months asking her to explain basic concepts he should have learned in his sophomore databases course. Jake, who'd nodded along in meetings while she did the actual work, then somehow ended up credited in client presentations. Jake, whose fresh perspective consisted mainly of suggesting they migrate everything to whatever cloud platform was trending on tech blogs that week. "I see," Becca managed, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "And what time frame are we looking at for this transition?" "We'd like to give you 2 weeks to transition your responsibilities and document your processes." Amanda spoke for the first time, her voice carefully neutral. "Jake will be starting in the systems role at $65,000 annually, which represents significant savings for the department. Half her salary. They were replacing her with her former intern at half her salary. The insult was so blatant, so perfectly calculated, that Becca almost admired its audacity. Almost. "I trust this decision has nothing to do with the successful resolution of last night's database crisis?" Becca asked quietly. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry. What?" "Crisis. I wasn't aware of any issues." Of course he wasn't. The man who'd decided she was expendable didn't even know she'd worked through the night to save his company millions of dollars. He probably thought systems just magically maintained themselves, that the complex infrastructure she'd built from scratch was as simple as his morning coffee routine. "Minor issue," she replied, watching Amanda's face carefully. The HR director's eyes had widened slightly. She'd clearly checked the incident logs this morning and knew exactly what Becca had accomplished. Nothing that couldn't be handled. "Well, that's excellent," Blackwood said, already reaching for his phone in the universal signal that the meeting was over. "Amanda will handle the paperwork and logistics. I'm sure you understand this is simply a business decision, nothing personal." Nothing personal. The phrase echoed in Becca's mind as she stood, shook hands with professional courtesy, and walked toward the door. 5 years of her life, countless nights and weekends, the entire digital backbone of the company, none of it personal. "Rebecca," Amanda called softly as they left Blackwood's office. Could we schedule some time later today to discuss the transition details? Of course, Becca replied, noting the genuine distress in the older woman's voice. Amanda Phillips had been at InnovateTech since before Blackwood's arrival, back when it had been a company that valued expertise over cost optimization. She was clearly struggling with this decision. As they parted ways in the hallway, Becca caught sight of Jake Morrison emerging from the elevator, his usual confident smile bright enough to power the building. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition that he'd stepped into something far beyond his capabilities. "Becca," he called out, jogging to catch up with her. "Hey, I hope there aren't any hard feelings about... Well, you know. I tried to put in a good word for you, but Blackwood was pretty determined about the restructuring." The lie came so easily to him, delivered with such practiced sincerity, that she almost believed he believed it himself. Jake Morrison, the golden boy who'd networked his way into a position he couldn't possibly fill, trying to position himself as her advocate while taking over her life's work. "No hard feelings at all," she said, her smile never wavering. "I'm sure you'll do just fine with the transition." Something in her tone must have registered because Jake's smile became slightly uncertain. "Great. I mean, I know I have big shoes to fill. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime and you could give me some pointers about the more complex systems?" "I'd be happy to help during the transition period," Becca replied smoothly. "After all, you'll need to understand everything before I'm gone." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the hallway with a puzzled expression. Her mind was already racing, cataloging everything she knew about InnovateTech's systems, their vulnerabilities, their dependencies. 2 weeks to document 5 years of work for someone who couldn't distinguish between a database index and a web cache. They thought they were getting a bargain, trading her expertise for Jake's enthusiasm and half the salary. What they were actually getting was a front-row seat to exactly how valuable that expertise had been. Becca Harper had built these systems. She understood them in ways that couldn't be captured in documentation or explained in handover meetings. And if InnovateTech wanted to learn that lesson the hard way, she was more than willing to be their teacher. The polite smile never left her face as she returned to her desk, but her eyes had taken on a calculating glint that would have worried anyone who truly knew her. The methodical mind that had solved countless technical crises was now focused on a very different kind of problem, and for the first time in 5 years, InnovateTech was about to discover exactly what happened. The polite smile never left her face as she returned to her desk, but her eyes had taken on a calculating glint that would have worried anyone who truly knew her. The methodical mind that had solved countless technical crises was now focused on a very different kind of problem. By the time Jake appeared at her cubicle that afternoon, laptop bag slung over his shoulder and an eager expression on his face, Becca had already begun crafting what would become the most comprehensive and strategically incomplete documentation in InnovateTech's history. "So," Jake said, settling into the guest chair she'd pulled up beside her workstation, "where should we start?" Becca turned from her monitors, a stack of printed diagrams and technical specifications already prepared. "I thought we'd begin with the overall system architecture. Here's the high-level overview of how everything connects." She spread out a diagram that looked like a subway map designed by someone having a fever dream. Boxes connected by lines of varying colors and thickness, with annotations in her precise handwriting. To Jake's credit, he leaned forward with apparent interest, though she noticed his eyes glazing over almost immediately. "This shows the data flow between our primary client systems and the back-end infrastructure," she continued, pointing to various sections. "The blue lines represent direct database connections, red is our caching layer, and green indicates the real-time synchronization processes." "Right, okay," Jake nodded, pulling out his phone to take a picture of the diagram. "And this covers all the clients?" "The major ones." Becca's smile remained perfectly professional. though each implementation has its own unique requirements. Morrison Industries, for instance, requires custom data validation routines that run every 6 hours, while the Peterson Group needs real-time inventory tracking with specific failure recovery protocols. She watched Jake's face carefully as she rattled off technical details, noting how he nodded along without asking for clarification. A competent systems architect would have immediately questioned the specifics. What kind of validation? What triggers the recovery protocols? How? The different systems prioritize resources during peak load. Jake simply continued nodding, occasionally muttering, "Makes sense," or "Got it." "Let's move on to the database architecture," Becca said, pulling up another diagram on her screen. This one showed the complex relationships between 17 different databases, each serving specific functions in the overall ecosystem she'd built. This is where things get interesting. 17 databases? Jake's voice cracked slightly. That seems like a lot. Each serves a specific purpose, Becca explained patiently. We have the primary transaction databases, the analytics, warehouses, the real-time caching systems, the backup and recovery databases, and the specialized databases for specific client requirements. They all need to stay synchronized, but the synchronization rules vary depending on the data type and client needs. She began explaining the intricate web of dependencies, noting how Jake's confident expression gradually morphed into something approaching panic. He was taking notes frantically now, but she could see him struggling to keep up with concepts that required years of experience to truly understand. "The key thing to remember," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "is that the system is largely self-healing. Most issues resolve themselves if you just give them time. The worst thing you can do is panic and start making changes without understanding the full impact." This was technically true but misleadingly incomplete. Yes, many issues were self-healing, but recognizing which ones required immediate intervention was the difference between a minor hiccup and a catastrophic failure. She was essentially telling him to ignore warning signs that could indicate serious problems. "That's a relief," Jake said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "I was worried I'd need to memorize every single process." "Oh, you don't need to memorize anything," Becca assured him. "That's what documentation is for. Speaking of which, I've been working on comprehensive guides for everything." She gestured to her computer screen, where she'd been typing steadily for hours. "By the time I'm done, you'll have step-by-step instructions for every major process." What she didn't mention was that her documentation was a masterpiece of selective omission. Every procedure was technically accurate, but crucial context was missing. She described what to do, but not why, how to fix specific problems, but not how to recognize when those problems were symptoms of larger issues. It was like giving someone a recipe that listed ingredients and cooking times, but omitted crucial steps like preheating the oven or when to add each ingredient. "Becca?" She looked up to see Chloe Winters hovering at the edge of her cubicle. The young developer's face flushed with obvious anger. "Could I speak with you for a minute? Privately?" "Of course." Becca stood, noting how Jake barely looked up from the diagrams he was photographing with his phone. "Jake, why don't you review these materials, and we'll continue tomorrow?" Chloe led her to an empty conference room, closing the door behind them with perhaps more force than necessary. "This is insane," Chloe said without preamble. "I just heard about the restructuring. They're really replacing you with Jake Morrison?" Becca had always appreciated Chloe's directness. The young woman had been one of her interns 2 years ago, someone who'd actually listened during training sessions and asked intelligent questions. Unlike Jake, Chloe had the technical curiosity and attention to detail that made for a good systems architect. "It's a business decision," Becca replied neutrally, though she noted the way Chloe's hands clenched into fists. "It's discrimination is what it is," Chloe shot back. "Jake couldn't configure a router if his life depended on it, and they're putting Him in charge of systems that handle millions of dollars in transactions? I've seen him try to troubleshoot a printer jam. It took him 40 minutes and 3 help desk tickets. Despite everything, Becca felt a genuine smile tugging at her lips. He'll learn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Will he? Because from what I've observed, Jake Morrison's primary skill is taking credit for other people's work while avoiding anything that requires actual technical knowledge. Chloe's voice dropped to a whisper. I've been keeping notes, Documentation of meetings where you solved problems that he later presented as his own ideas. The Morrison Industries implementation? He told Blackwood it was his optimization strategy, but I was there when you designed the entire architecture. This was interesting. Becca had suspected that others had noticed Jake's tendency to claim credit, but she hadn't realized anyone was actively documenting it. You've been keeping notes? Screenshots, email chains, meeting recordings when possible. I've been watching this company change under Blackwood, and it's not changing for the better. They're systematically getting rid of anyone with actual expertise and replacing them with cheaper alternatives who look good in meetings, but can't do the actual work. Becca studied the younger woman's face, seeing the genuine outrage there. Chloe wasn't just upset about the unfairness of the situation. She was worried about the technical implications of having incompetent people in critical roles. I appreciate your concern, Becca said carefully, but I'll be fine. The consulting market is strong right now. That's not what I'm worried about, Chloe replied. I'm worried about what happens to our systems when you're gone, and Jake realizes he's in over his head. I'm worried about our clients' data, about the reputation of everyone who's worked here, about... She was interrupted by Becca's phone buzzing. Marcus Thompson's name appeared on the screen. I should take this, Becca said, stepping into the hallway. Marcus. Becca, I just heard. Are you somewhere you can talk freely? Marcus Thompson had been her mentor and advocate since her second year at InnovateTech, back when he was CTO and the company still prioritized technical excellence over cost optimization. His forced early retirement 6 months ago had been another sign of Blackwood's priorities. I'm in the office, but I can speak quietly. This is about the restructuring, isn't it? Replacing you with that Morrison kid? That's correct. Jesus Christ. Marcus's voice carried the weight of genuine disgust. I've been hearing rumors about similar moves in other departments. Blackwood systematically getting rid of anyone who might pose a threat to his narrative that everything can be done cheaper and faster. It's certainly a business decision, Becca replied, aware that others might be listening. It's a disaster. In the making, and we both know it. Listen, are you free for dinner tonight? There are some things we should discuss and not over the phone. Becca glanced back toward the conference room where Chloe waited, then toward her cubicle where Jake was probably still trying to make sense of system diagrams that would have challenged someone with 5 times his experience. Dinner sounds perfect, she said. 7 o'clock? I'll text you the address. And Becca, don't do anything rash. This situation may have more potential than you realize. As she hung up, Becca found herself genuinely curious about what Marcus had in mind. Her former mentor had always been a strategic thinker, someone who saw opportunities where others saw only problems. She returned to the conference room where Chloe was pacing like a caged animal. Everything okay? Chloe asked. Everything's fine, Becca replied, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. But I appreciate your concern and I'd like you to keep doing what you're doing. Documentation is always valuable. You mean the notes about Jake's incompetence? I mean the documentation of technical decisions and their outcomes. Accurate record-keeping is always good practice. Chloe studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. I understand. Accurate record-keeping. As they returned to the main office area, Becca saw Jake still hunched over her diagrams, phone in hand, probably texting someone about how complex everything was. Tomorrow she'd continue the handover process, feeding him information at a pace that guaranteed confusion while maintaining plausible helpfulness. But tonight, she'd have dinner with Marcus and find out exactly what opportunities he saw in this situation. Because if there was one thing Becca had learned during her years of solving impossible technical problems, it was that every system had vulnerabilities. And InnovateTech was about to discover that their most critical vulnerability had just been reclassified from asset to threat. 2 weeks later, Becca Harper's final day arrived with all the fanfare of a software update. Technically significant, but utterly invisible to those who didn't understand what was actually happening. No goodbye party, no recognition ceremony, no acknowledgement of the 5 years she'd spent building the digital backbone that kept the company operational. Just a cardboard box on her desk and a security badge that would expire at 5 p.m. She methodically packed her personal items, the small succulent that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights, a few technical books that actually belonged to her, and the Wisconsin Badger's coffee mug her brother Michael had given her when she'd gotten the job. Everything else, the awards, the commendations, the thank you notes from grateful clients, she left behind. They belonged to a version of herself that had believed loyalty and competence would be rewarded. "The documentation handover is complete," she told Amanda Phillips, handing over a thick binder and a USB drive. "Everything Jake needs should be in there." Amanda accepted the materials with obvious discomfort, her usual professional composure cracking slightly. "Becca, I want you to know that this wasn't my recommendation." "I understand," Becca replied, though they both knew that Amanda's objections, if any, had carried little weight with Blackwood. "You were following company policy. If you need a reference or if there's anything I can do, I appreciate that." Becca's smile was genuine, but distant. Amanda Phillips was a decent person trapped in an indecent situation, and extending forgiveness cost nothing while potentially providing future value. Jake appeared at her cubicle just as she was shutting down her workstation for the final time. 2 weeks of training had done nothing to improve his confidence. If anything, he looked more nervous than when they'd started. "So," he said, shifting, his weight from foot to foot. "I guess this is it." "I guess it is." Becca turned to face him, noting the way his eyes darted nervously between her face and the comprehensive documentation stack on her desk. "You have everything you need?" "Yeah, definitely. The documentation is really thorough." He paused, then added with forced enthusiasm, "I'm actually excited about the challenge, you know? Fresh perspective and all that." Becca nodded thoughtfully. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd watched Jake struggle with concepts that should have been elementary for someone in his position. His fresh perspective consisted mainly of suggesting they migrate everything to whatever cloud platform was currently trending on LinkedIn, regardless of whether such a migration made technical or financial sense. "I'm sure you'll bring interesting changes to the role," she said. "Just remember what we discussed about the system being largely self-healing. Most issues resolve themselves if you give them time." It was the same misleading advice she'd given him repeatedly during their training sessions. True in the narrowest technical sense, but missing the crucial context of when immediate intervention was necessary. Jake nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have simple rules to follow. "And if something major comes up, I can always call you for consultation, right?" "During business hours, at my consulting rates," Becca replied smoothly. She'd established Harper Systems Consulting 3 days ago, complete with a professional website and rate structure that would make Blackwood's cost-cutting philosophy weep. "My standard emergency consultation fee is $300 per hour with a 4-hour minimum." Jake's face went slightly pale. "Right. Well, I'm sure I won't need to call. Everything should be pretty straightforward." "I'm sure it will be," Becca agreed, though her definition of straightforward probably differed significantly from his. As Jake wandered back to what was now his workstation, Chloe Winters appeared with a small wrapped package. "A going-away gift," she said quietly, glancing around, "to make sure they weren't being overheard. Something to remember us by." Becca unwrapped the package to find a sleek external hard drive. "Chloe, you didn't need to—" "It's 2 TB," Chloe interrupted softly. "Plenty of space for documentation, archive files, that sort of thing." Her eyes met Becca's meaningfully. The kind of comprehensive documentation that might be useful for future reference. Understanding passed between them. Chloe had been busy during the past 2 weeks, creating backups of system logs, incident reports, and performance metrics that painted a clear picture of InnovateTech's technical operations under Becca's management. Information that might prove valuable if questions ever arose about competence and decision-making. "Thank you," Becca said, slipping the drive into her purse. "That's very thoughtful." "Just promise me you'll stay in touch," Chloe said. "And if you ever need someone who actually knows how these systems work, I'll keep that in mind." Her final stop was Amanda Phillips' office, where she returned her security badge and signed the last of her separation paperwork. The exit interview was a formality. Bland questions about her experience working at InnovateTech, her reasons for leaving, as if she'd had a choice, and suggestions for improvement. Where would she even begin? "I hope you find something that better values your expertise," Amanda said as they finished. "I'm confident I will," Becca replied. "The consulting market is quite strong right now, especially for people with specialized knowledge of complex systems." She left InnovateTech at 4:47 p.m., 13 minutes before her badge would have automatically deactivated. The security guard nodded politely as she passed through the lobby for what everyone assumed was the last time. Her rental car was waiting in the parking garage, loaded with the cardboard box and her future as an independent consultant. Driving through San Francisco's evening traffic, Becca felt an unexpected sense of liberation. For 5 years, she'd been responsible for keeping InnovateTech systems running, often at the expense of her own well-being. She'd worked weekends, canceled vacations, and sacrificed countless evenings to solve problems that only she could fix. Now, for the first time since college, someone else's crisis was someone else's responsibility. Her apartment in the Mission District felt different when she walked in, no longer just the place where she slept between work emergencies. She set up her new home office in the spare bedroom, arranging her laptop and monitors with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to server configurations. The Harper Systems Consulting website was already generating inquiries from companies who understood the value of experienced systems architecture. At 6:23 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. "First system alert just came in." Jake looked at it for about 10 minutes, then marked it as resolved without doing anything. "Thought you should know." Becca smiled as she replied, "Self-healing systems. They usually work themselves out." She poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto her couch with her laptop, reviewing the business plan she'd been developing. Harper Systems Consulting would specialize in complex enterprise architecture, system optimization, and crisis resolution. Her rate structure was premium but fair, reflecting the reality that true expertise commanded a price. Her phone rang as she was updating her LinkedIn profile. Marcus Thompson's name appeared on the screen. "How does it feel to be a free woman?" he asked without preamble. "Liberating," she replied honestly. "Also terrifying, but mostly liberating." "Good. That means you're ready for what comes next." "Which is?" "Patience," Marcus said. "Jake, Morrison is about to get a very expensive education in the difference between knowing about systems and actually understanding them. And when that education begins, Harper Systems Consulting is going to be in very high demand." Becca leaned back against her couch cushions, wine glass in hand, watching the San Francisco skyline light up as darkness fell. Somewhere across the city, Jake Morrison was probably going home from his first official day as InnovateTech's lead systems architect. confident that he'd successfully taken over one of the most complex technical operations in the consulting industry. He had no idea that the systems he'd inherited were held together by institutional knowledge that couldn't be captured in documentation, maintained by subtle interventions that prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic failures, and dependent on a level of technical intuition that took years to develop. But he was about to learn. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with another text from Chloe. Second alert just came in. This one looks more serious. Jake's asking if anyone knows your personal number. Becca typed back, I'm sure he'll figure it out. The systems are very resilient. She set her phone aside and opened her laptop to review the day's consulting inquiries. Tomorrow, she would begin building Harper Systems Consulting into the kind of company she'd always wanted to work for. One that valued expertise over politics, competence over cost-cutting, and technical excellence over corporate theater. Tonight, she would simply enjoy the strange peace of knowing that when the next crisis hit InnovateTech's servers, someone else would be the one receiving the emergency alerts. For the first time in 5 years, Rebecca Harper slept through the night without checking her phone. That peace lasted exactly 3 weeks. The first crack in InnovateTech's facade appeared on a Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m., when the Morrison Industries payment processing system experienced what Jake Morrison would later describe in his incident report as a minor database hiccup. In reality, the primary transaction database had begun rejecting connection requests due to a cascading memory leak in the connection pooling module, the same type of issue Becca had prevented dozens of times through proactive monitoring and preventive maintenance. Jake's solution was to restart the database server. This worked, technically. The immediate problem disappeared, and transactions resumed flowing. What Jake didn't realize was that his fix was equivalent to treating a brain tumor with aspirin. It addressed the symptoms while allowing the underlying condition to metastasize. Becca learned about this first crisis from Chloe, who texted her a screenshot of Jake's incident report along with a single word: yikes. The report was a masterpiece of confident incompetence. Jake had documented the problem, his solution, and his conclusion that the issue was resolved through standard database maintenance procedures. He'd even added a note about implementing more robust monitoring to prevent similar issues in the future, apparently unaware that the monitoring system Becca had built was already tracking 17 different indicators that would have predicted this exact failure. Standard database maintenance procedures, Becca murmured to herself, sipping coffee in her new home office while reviewing the report on her laptop. Jake had restarted a production database during peak business hours without identifying the root cause, analyzing the impact on connected systems, or implementing any safeguards against data corruption. In the systems architecture world, this was roughly equivalent to performing surgery with a chainsaw. Her phone buzzed with another message from Chloe. Peterson Group reporting intermittent connection issues now. Jake says it's probably related to their internet provider. Becca set down her coffee cup and pulled up the system architecture diagrams she'd retained. The Peterson Group's issues weren't related to their internet provider. They were connected to the same back-end infrastructure that supported Morrison Industries. Jake's database restart had likely corrupted the connection state tables that managed client-specific configurations, causing downstream effects that would be nearly impossible to trace without understanding the system's internal dependencies. By Thursday, 3 more clients had reported intermittent issues with their InnovateTech managed systems. Jake's response, according to Chloe's updates, was to schedule individual troubleshooting sessions with each client, apparently unaware that he was treating symptoms of a single underlying problem. He's been working 16-hour days, Chloe reported during one of their carefully casual coffee meetings. Looks absolutely exhausted. Amanda Phillips asked him yesterday if he needed additional support, and he insisted everything was under control. Our pride goeth before the fall, Becca observed, though she felt a small pang of professional sympathy. Jake was drowning, but his arrogance prevented him from admitting he needed help. There's something else, Chloe continued, lowering her voice. I've been monitoring the system performance metrics you taught me to track. Error rates are up 40% since you left. Average response times have increased by 23%. And we've had 6 incidents that would have triggered your automatic escalation protocols. But no major outages yet? Not yet. But the trends are all pointing in the wrong direction. Chloe pulled out her phone and showed Becca a graph that looked like a heart monitor for a patient in distress. How long do you think we have before something catastrophic happens? Becca studied the data, her analytical mind automatically calculating failure probabilities and cascade scenarios. Based on these trends, 2 weeks, maybe 3 before something breaks that Jake can't fix with a restart. She was off by 4 days. The call came on a Friday afternoon while Becca was working on a system optimization proposal for a potential client in Austin. Jake Morrison's name appeared on her phone screen, and she let it ring 3 times before answering. Harper Systems. Consulting, this is Rebecca. Becca, thank God. It's Jake. We have a situation here, and I was hoping you could give me some quick guidance. His voice carried the particular strain that came from staring at critical system failures while having no idea how to fix them. Becca had heard that tone before, usually from clients who'd waited until their systems were actively melting down before calling for professional help. I'd be happy to discuss consulting services, she replied professionally. My emergency. Consultation rate is $300 per hour with a 4-hour minimum, and I'll need a purchase order before we begin. 300. Jesus, Becca, can't you just give me a quick pointer? We used to work together. She agreed. Now I'm an independent consultant, and this is my business. Would you like me to send you a consulting agreement, or would you prefer to handle this internally? There was a long pause during which she could hear the background noise of what sounded like a war room. Multiple people talking urgently, phones ringing, the distinctive sound of keyboards being pounded by people who were typing faster than they were thinking. Okay, fine, send me the agreement. But I need help now, Becca. The Peterson Group's entire inventory system just went down, and they're threatening to terminate their contract if we don't get it back online in the next 2 hours. Becca pulled up her standard emergency consulting contract and emailed it to Jake's InnovateTech address. I'll need that signed and returned before we begin. Once I receive it, I can start troubleshooting. How long will that take? The contract review? About 10 minutes if you don't negotiate any terms. No, the fix. How long to get Peterson Group back online? Becca smiled, though he couldn't see it. That depends on what you broke, Mr. Morrison. I'll need to assess the situation before providing any estimates. 23 minutes later, she had a signed consulting agreement and remote access to InnovateTech systems. What she found was even worse than she'd expected. Jake's series of quick fixes over the past 3 weeks had created a cascade of interconnected problems that were like dominoes arranged in a complex pattern, each small issue contributing to larger instabilities that were now reaching critical mass. The Peterson Group outage was just the most visible symptom of a system that was systematically failing under the weight of inadequate maintenance and misguided interventions. Jake had been treating individual problems without understanding how they connected to the larger ecosystem, like a mechanic who fixed a squeaky belt by removing the engine. The good news, Becca told Jake during their first consultation call, is that the Peterson Group issue is fixable. The bad news is that your system architecture is currently in a state that my former mentor would have described as catastrophically fragile. What does that mean? It means that fixing Peterson Group will likely cause problems elsewhere, because you've created dependencies that shouldn't exist and removed safeguards that should still be in place. So, what do you recommend? Becca leaned back in her chair, looking out at the San Francisco skyline while calculating both the technical complexity and the business opportunity. I recommend a comprehensive system audit and stabilization project. Based on what I'm seeing, You're looking at approximately 60 hours of consulting work to properly address the underlying issues. 60 hours? That's $18,000. It's also significantly less than the penalties. You'll pay if Peterson Group terminates their contract, or the reputation damage if word gets out that InnovateTech can't maintain system stability. Another long pause, during which she could almost hear Jake doing the math and realizing that his cost-saving replacement strategy was about to become very expensive. Can you start immediately? I can start as soon as the initial consultation fee is processed, Becca replied. But Jake? This is just stabilization. The systemic issues that led to this situation will require a much more comprehensive solution. As she hung up and began her forensic analysis of the damage Jake had inflicted on her carefully architected systems, Becca felt a complex mix of professional satisfaction and genuine concern. Satisfaction that her value was being demonstrated, in the most concrete terms possible, but concern that years of careful work was being systematically destroyed by someone who didn't understand what he was breaking. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Heard through the grapevine that InnovateTech just engaged emergency consulting services. How's the liberation business treating you? She typed back, expensive for them, profitable for me. Exactly as predicted. Outside her window, the fog was rolling in from the bay, obscuring the city in a gray shroud. Somewhere across town, Jake Morrison was probably staring at system monitors that showed problems he couldn't solve, finally beginning to understand the difference between managing systems and actually understanding them. The education Rebecca Harper had predicted was officially underway. 18 hours later, Becca walked through the familiar glass doors of InnovateTech for the first time in 3 weeks, but everything had changed. She was no longer the undervalued employee carrying a worn laptop bag and hoping her security badge would work. Now she was Harper Systems Consulting, arriving with a premium hourly rate, a signed emergency contract, and the kind of leverage that came from being the only person who could solve their crisis. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly when she saw Becca approaching the desk. Ms. Harper, I'll need to get you a visitor's badge. That would be perfect, Becca replied with professional courtesy, noting how strange it felt to be treated as an outsider in a building where she'd spent 5 years of her life. I'm here for an emergency consultation with Jake Morrison. The bye. Visitor's badge felt oddly liberating. No more employee obligations, no more unpaid overtime, no more responsibility for problems she didn't create. She was here strictly as a consultant, bound only by the terms of her contract and her professional ethics. Jake met her at the elevator, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his Stanford polo shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke to the kind of stress that came from being responsible for systems you didn't understand. Becca, thank God you're here, he said, practically vibrating with nervous energy. The Peterson Group situation is contained for now, but we've got 3 other clients reporting issues, and I think they might be related. They are, Becca confirmed, following him toward the elevator. The Peterson outage was a symptom, not the root cause. We'll need to address the underlying architectural problems before they cascade into something worse. How much worse are we talking? Becca studied his face, seeing genuine fear behind the bravado. 3 weeks ago, Jake Morrison had been confident that systems architecture was just a matter of following documentation and applying basic troubleshooting skills. Now he was discovering that expertise couldn't be faked or learned from YouTube tutorials. That depends on how quickly we can implement proper fixes, she said diplomatically. But Jake, I need you to understand something. The problems you're seeing aren't random failures. They're the predictable result of maintenance decisions that didn't account for system interdependencies. The elevator doors opened to reveal Amanda Phillips waiting in the hallway, her expression a careful mixture of relief and embarrassment. Behind her stood Richard Blackwood, looking like a man who'd just discovered that his cost-cutting measures were about to become very expensive. "Rebecca," Blackwood said with forced warmth, extending his hand. "I appreciate you coming in to help us resolve these technical issues." Becca shook his hand with professional courtesy, noting how his grip lingered slightly longer than necessary, the handshake of a man trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "I'm happy to provide consulting services," she replied. "Though I should mention that based on my initial assessment, this project will require significantly more time than the, emergency stabilization we discussed." Blackwood's smile faltered. "How much more time?" "My preliminary estimate is 60 to 80 hours of consulting work to properly address the systemic issues," Becca said, watching his face carefully. "That's assuming we can prevent any additional, critical failures during the remediation process." She could almost see the calculator running in Blackwood's head. 80 hours at $300 per hour was $24,000, more than a third of what they'd planned to save by replacing her with Jake. And that was just to fix the problems they'd created in 3 weeks. "Perhaps we could discuss a more cost-effective approach," Blackwood suggested. "I'm certainly open to discussing options," Becca replied smoothly. "Though I should point out that the alternative to proper remediation is likely to be much more expensive. Based on the system instabilities I observed yesterday, you're looking at potential client contract terminations, data integrity issues, and significant reputation damage if these problems aren't addressed properly." Amanda Phillips cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to a conference room." 20 minutes later, they were seated around the same conference table where Becca had once presented quarterly system performance reports to executives who barely understood what she was telling them. Now she sat across from Blackwood with a consulting contract between them, her laptop displaying graphs that painted a dire picture of InnovateTech's technical health. "The core issue," Becca explained, pointing to a chart showing error rates, "over time, is that your systems require proactive maintenance and monitoring that goes beyond basic troubleshooting. The documentation I provided during the transition covered standard procedures, but it couldn't capture the institutional knowledge needed to prevent problems before they occur." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The documentation was very thorough. I followed all the procedures exactly." "You followed the procedures correctly," Becca agreed diplomatically. "But preventing system failures requires understanding why those procedures exist and recognizing when standard approaches aren't sufficient. That's not a criticism. It's simply the reality of managing complex enterprise systems." Blackwood leaned forward. "So what you're saying is that we need ongoing consulting support." "What I'm saying is that you need someone with the expertise to maintain these systems properly. That could be ongoing consulting support, or it could be hiring someone with the appropriate background and experience." "How much would ongoing consulting cost?" Becca had anticipated this question and had her answer ready. "For a comprehensive support contract that includes system monitoring, preventive maintenance, and emergency response, my standard rate is $15,000 per month with a 6-month minimum commitment." The silence that followed was profound. $90,000 for 6 months of consulting services, more than Jake's entire annual salary, and nearly as much as they'd been paying her before the restructuring. "That seems rather expensive," Blackwood said carefully. "It's significantly less expensive than the alternative," Becca replied, clicking to a new slide that showed potential costs of system failures. "A single major outage could result in contract penalties exceeding $200,000, not including the long-term reputation damage to your consulting practice." Amanda Phillips spoke for the first time during the meeting. "What would be involved in this support contract?" "Monthly system health assessments, proactive maintenance windows, documentation updates, and 24/7 emergency response capability," Becca explained. "Essentially, the level of system stewardship that these architectures require to remain stable." Jake looked miserable. "So basically, you'd be doing my job. You'd still be the primary point of contact for routine issues and client communications, Becca said diplomatically. But for complex technical problems and system architecture decisions, yes, you'd be working with me as your consulting specialist. Blackwood stood and walked to the window, staring out at the San Francisco skyline while presumably calculating the cost of his cost-cutting measures. When he turned back to the table, his expression was resigned. Let's start with the immediate. Stabilization work, he said. 60 hours at your consulting rate. We'll discuss the ongoing support contract after we've resolved the current crisis. That works, Becca agreed, though they both knew he'd eventually accept the support contract. The alternative was replacing Jake with someone who had her level of expertise, and qualified systems architects were commanding salaries well above what they'd been paying her. As they finalized the consulting agreement, Becca felt a profound satisfaction. 3 weeks ago, she'd been an undervalued employee earning $130,000 per year with no job security. Now she was an independent consultant earning $300 per hour, working on her own terms, with InnovateTech forced to acknowledge the value of her expertise in the most concrete way possible. By paying premium rates for services they'd foolishly decided they could do without. I'll start the stabilization work immediately, she told Jake as they left the conference room. But I want to be clear about expectations. This is going to require some significant changes to how these systems are maintained. Are you prepared for that? Jake nodded reluctantly. Whatever it takes to keep the systems stable. Good, Becca said, settling into the temporary workstation they'd arranged for her. Because you're about to learn exactly how these systems actually work. As she logged into the familiar interfaces and began her forensic analysis of the damage, Becca couldn't help but smile. InnovateTech had paid dearly for their lesson in the value of expertise, and the education was just beginning. lie. Hours later, Becca walked through the familiar glass doors of InnovateTech for the first time in 3 weeks. But everything had changed. She was no longer the undervalued employee carrying a worn laptop bag and hoping her security badge would work. Now she was Harper Systems Consulting, arriving with a premium hourly rate, a signed emergency contract, and the kind of leverage that came from being the only person who could solve their crisis. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly when she saw Becca approaching the desk. Ms. Harper, I'll need to get you a visitor's badge. That would be perfect, Becca replied with professional courtesy, noting how strange it felt to be treated as an outsider in a building where she'd spent 5 years of her life. I'm here for an emergency consultation with Jake Morrison. The visitor's badge felt oddly liberating. No more employee obligations, no more unpaid overtime, no more responsibility for problems she didn't create. She was here strictly as a consultant, bound only by the terms of her contract and her professional ethics. Jake met her at the elevator, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his Stanford polo shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke to the kind of stress that came from being responsible for systems you didn't understand. Becca, thank God you're here, he said, practically vibrating with nervous energy. The Peterson Group situation is contained for now, but we've got 3 other clients reporting issues, and I think they might be related. They are, Becca confirmed, following him toward the elevator. The Peterson outage was a symptom, not the root cause. We'll need to address the underlying architectural problems before they cascade into something worse. How much worse are we talking? Becca studied his face, seeing genuine fear behind the bravado. 3 weeks ago, Jake Morrison had been confident that systems architecture was just a matter of following documentation and applying basic troubleshooting skills. Now he was discovering that expertise couldn't be faked or learned from YouTube tutorials. That depends on how quickly we can implement proper fixes, she said diplomatically. But Jake, I need you to understand something. The problems you're seeing aren't random failures. They're the predictable result of maintenance decisions that didn't account for system interdependencies. The elevator doors opened to reveal Amanda Phillips waiting in the hallway, her expression a careful mixture of relief and embarrassment. Behind her stood Richard Blackwood, looking like a man who'd just discovered that his cost-cutting measures were about to become very expensive. "Rebecca," Blackwood said with forced warmth, extending his hand. "I appreciate you coming in to help us resolve these technical issues." Becca shook his hand with professional courtesy, noting how his grip lingered slightly longer than necessary. The handshake of a man trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "I'm happy to provide consulting services," she replied. "Though, I should mention that based on my initial assessment, this project will require significantly more time than the emergency stabilization we discussed." Blackwood's smile faltered. "How much more time?" "My preliminary estimate is 60 to 80 hours of consulting work to properly address the systemic issues," Becca said, watching his face carefully. "That's assuming we can prevent any additional critical failures during the remediation process." She could almost see the calculator running in Blackwood's head. 80 hours at $300 per hour was $24,000, more than a third of what they'd planned, to save by replacing her with Jake. And that was just to fix the problems they'd created in 3 weeks. "Perhaps we could discuss a more cost-effective approach," Blackwood suggested. "I'm certainly open to discussing options," Becca replied smoothly, "though I should point out that the alternative to proper remediation is likely to be much more expensive. Based on the system instabilities I observed yesterday, you're looking at potential client contract terminations, data integrity issues, and significant reputation damage if these problems aren't addressed properly." Amanda Phillips cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should move this discussion to a conference room?" 20 minutes later, they were seated around the same conference table where Becca had once presented quarterly system performance reports to executives who barely understood what she was telling them. Now she sat across from Blackwood with a consulting contract between them, her laptop displaying graphs that painted a dire picture of InnovateTech's technical health. "The core issue," Becca explained, pointing to a chart showing error rates, "over time, is that your systems require proactive maintenance and monitoring that goes beyond basic troubleshooting. The documentation I provided during the transition covered standard procedures, but it couldn't capture the institutional knowledge needed to prevent problems before they occur." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The documentation was very thorough. I followed all the procedures exactly." "You followed the procedures correctly," Becca agreed diplomatically. "But preventing system failures requires understanding why those procedures exist and recognizing when standard approaches aren't sufficient. That's not a criticism. It's simply the reality of managing complex enterprise systems." Blackwood leaned forward. "So what you're saying is that we need ongoing consulting support?" "What I'm saying is that you need someone with the expertise to maintain these systems properly. That could be ongoing consulting support, or it could be hiring someone with the appropriate background and experience. How much would ongoing consulting cost?" Becca had anticipated this question and had her answer ready. "For a comprehensive support contract that includes system monitoring, preventive maintenance, and emergency response, my standard rate is $15,000 per month with a 6-month minimum commitment." The silence that followed was profound. $90,000 for 6 months of consulting services, more than Jake's entire annual salary and nearly as much as they'd been paying her before the restructuring. "That seems rather expensive," Blackwood said carefully. "It's significantly less expensive than the alternative," Becca replied, clicking to a new slide that showed potential costs of system failures. "A single major outage could result in contract penalties exceeding $200,000, not including the long-term reputation damage to your consulting practice." Amanda Phillips spoke for the first time during the meeting. What would be involved in this support contract? "Monthly system health assessments, proactive maintenance windows, documentation updates, and 24/7 emergency response capability, Becca explained. Essentially, the level of system stewardship that these architectures require to remain stable. Jake looked miserable. So, basically, you'd be doing my job. You'd still be the primary point of contact for routine issues and client communications, Becca said diplomatically. But for complex technical problems and system architecture decisions, yes, you'd be working with me as your consulting specialist. Blackwood stood and walked to the window, staring out at the San Francisco skyline while presumably calculating the cost of his cost-cutting measures. When he turned back to the table, his expression was resigned. "Let's start with the immediate. Stabilization work," he said. 60 hours at your consulting rate. We'll discuss the ongoing support contract after we've resolved the current crisis. That works, Becca agreed, though they both knew he'd eventually accept the support contract. The alternative was replacing Jake with someone who had her level of expertise, and qualified systems architects were commanding salaries well above what they'd been paying her. As they finalized the consulting agreement, Becca felt a profound satisfaction. 3 weeks ago, she'd been an undervalued employee earning $130,000 per year with no job security. Now she was an independent consultant earning $300 per hour, working on her own terms, with InnovateTech forced to acknowledge the value of her expertise in the most concrete way possible, by paying premium rates for services they'd foolishly decided they could do without. "I'll start the stabilization work immediately," she told Jake as they left the conference room. "But I want to be clear about expectations. This is going to require some significant changes to how these systems are maintained. Are you prepared for that?" Jake nodded reluctantly. "Whatever it takes to keep the system stable." "Good," Becca said, settling into the temporary workstation they'd arranged for her. "Because you're about to learn exactly how these systems actually work." As she logged into the familiar interfaces and began her forensic analysis of the damage, Becca couldn't help but smile. InnovateTech had paid dearly for their lesson in the value of expertise, and the education was just beginning. 3 days. Into her stabilization project, Becca discovered something that made her stop typing mid-command and stare at her screen in disbelief. What she'd initially assumed was incompetent management was actually part of a much more systematic pattern, one that went far beyond Jake Morrison's technical inadequacies. She was deep in the system logs, tracing the cascade of failures that had led to the Peterson Group outage, when she noticed anomalies in the user access records. Someone had been systematically accessing HR databases, payroll systems, and employee performance files, areas that had nothing to do with the technical infrastructure she was supposed to be stabilizing. The access patterns were sophisticated enough to avoid triggering automatic security alerts, but sloppy enough that someone with her level of system knowledge could spot them. More troubling, the timestamps corresponded with personnel decisions that had affected several of her former colleagues. Becca glanced around the temporary workspace they'd given her, a desk in an unused conference room with a clear view of the main office area. Jake was visible through the glass walls, hunched over his workstation, probably wondering why his latest fix had caused 3 new problems. Amanda Phillips was in her office, door closed, speaking intensely on the phone. She opened a secure text message to Chloe. "Can you take a coffee break? Need to discuss something offline." 20 minutes later, they were seated in a cafe 3 blocks from InnovateTech, far enough away to avoid accidental eavesdropping by colleagues. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest," Becca said quietly. "How many senior employees have left or been restructured since Blackwood took over?" Chloe's expression grew grim. "You really want the full list?" "Everything you can remember." Chloe pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be detailed notes. Marcus Thompson, obviously. Sarah Chen from accounting. 15. Years with the company, replaced by a recent college graduate at 60% of her salary. David Rodriguez from business development, Jennifer Kim from Quality Assurance, Patricia Williams from Project Management. She paused, looking up at Becca. Should I keep going? How many total? 17 people in the past 18 months, all senior-level positions, all with significant institutional knowledge, all replaced by cheaper alternatives. Chloe's voice dropped to a whisper. And Becca? 14 of them were women. The pattern crystallized with sickening clarity. This wasn't just cost-cutting. It was systematic discrimination disguised as operational optimization. Blackwood was deliberately targeting experienced female employees, replacing them with younger, cheaper, predominantly male alternatives. Do you have documentation of these decisions? Some. I've been keeping notes since Marcus was forced out, but I didn't realize the full scope until you asked. Chloe leaned forward conspiratorially. But there's more. I've been monitoring the system performance metrics like you taught me, and I noticed something interesting. The departments that lost senior female employees are consistently underperforming compared to their previous benchmarks. Show me. Chloe pulled up a spreadsheet on her phone that would have made any data analyst proud. She'd been tracking productivity metrics, error rates, client satisfaction scores, and project delivery times across different departments, correlating them with personnel changes. Quality assurance error detection dropped by 43% after Jennifer Kim was replaced, she explained. Business development's client retention rate fell from 94% to 78% after David Rodriguez left. And accounting. She paused, pointing to a particularly damning chart. 3 major billing errors in the past 6 months, including one that nearly cost us the Morrison Industries contract. Becca studied the data, her analytical mind, processing the implications. This isn't just discrimination. It's institutionalized incompetence. He's systematically removing the people who actually know how to do the work. It gets worse, Chloe continued. I did some research on Blackwood's background. This isn't the first company where he's implemented this strategy. His previous position was at TechFlow Solutions in Austin. Want to guess what happened there? Tell me. Massive client exodus after 18 months, federal investigation for discriminatory hiring practices, and a class action lawsuit that cost the company $12 million in settlements. Chloe's eyes were bright with anger. He was quietly let go right before the lawsuit was filed, but his severance package included a non-disclosure agreement that prevented the details from becoming public. Becca felt a cold fury building in her chest. She'd assumed her termination was about cost-cutting and Jake's connections. The reality was far more sinister. She'd been targeted specifically because she was a competent woman whose expertise threatened Blackwood's narrative about operational efficiency. Chloe, I need you to be very careful with this information, she said quietly. If Blackwood realizes you're documenting his decisions. I know. I've been storing everything on personal devices and encrypted cloud storage. But Becca, we can't just sit on this. Other people are going to lose their jobs. And more importantly, InnovateTech's clients are going to suffer because the company is systematically replacing competent people with incompetent ones. Before Becca could respond, her phone buzzed, with a call from an unknown number. Harper Systems Consulting, this is Rebecca. Ms. Harper, this is Jennifer Walsh from the San Francisco Chronicle. I'm an investigative reporter specializing in Silicon Valley employment practices. I was wondering if you might have time to discuss your recent experience at InnovateTech. Becca's pulse quickened. May I ask how you got my number? I've been investigating patterns of age and gender discrimination in the tech industry. Your name came up in connection with several other cases involving experienced employees being replaced by younger, cheaper alternatives. I understand you might have insights into InnovateTech's recent personnel decisions. Becca looked across the table at Chloe, who was listening intently despite being able to hear only one side of the conversation. I'd be interested in discussing this, Becca said carefully. Though I should mention that I'm currently providing consulting services to InnovateTech, so there may be some limitations on what I can share. I understand completely. Would you be available for a preliminary conversation sometime this week? I can assure you that anything we discuss would be kept confidential until you're comfortable with how the information is used. Let me check my schedule and get back to you, Becca replied, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. After hanging up, she found Chloe staring at her with undisguised excitement. Please tell me that was what I think it was, Chloe said. An investigative journalist who's apparently been tracking the same patterns we just discussed. Becca leaned back in her chair, processing the convergence of events. The question is whether we're ready to escalate this beyond InnovateTech. What do you mean? I mean that talking to a journalist transforms this from a personal employment issue into a public discrimination case. There's no going back from that. Chloe was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone and scrolled through her documentation. Again. 17 people, Becca. 17 experienced professionals who've been systematically pushed out and replaced with cheaper alternatives. How many more before someone stops him? Becca thought about Marcus Thompson, who'd built InnovateTech's technical culture and been forced into early retirement. About Sarah Chen, who'd caught countless accounting errors over 15 years before being replaced by someone who'd already made 3 major mistakes. About all the institutional knowledge that was walking out the door, while Blackwood congratulated himself on operational efficiency. There's one more thing I need to verify first, she said, pulling out her laptop. If I'm going to make accusations about systematic discrimination, I need to be absolutely certain of my facts. She logged into InnovateTech's systems using her consulting access credentials and began querying databases she technically wasn't supposed to access. But her consulting contract gave her broad system access for troubleshooting purposes, and she was very good at finding information that others preferred to keep hidden. 20 minutes later, she had confirmation of what she'd suspected. Detailed HR records showing a clear pattern of targeting senior female employees, performance reviews that had been retroactively modified to justify terminations, and email chains discussing cost optimization strategies that used coded language to avoid explicitly discriminatory statements. Chloe, she said quietly, I think it's time to make some calls. As she scrolled through the evidence on her screen, Becca realized that her situation had evolved far beyond personal vindication. She wasn't just fighting for her own career anymore. She was in a position to expose systematic discrimination that affected dozens of employees and potentially transform how InnovateTech operated. The question was whether she was ready to become a whistleblower, knowing that such a decision would fundamentally change not just her relationship with InnovateTech, but her entire career in the tech industry. But looking at the data in front of her, and thinking about the 17 experienced professionals who'd been systematically pushed aside, she realized the choice had already been made. That evening, Becca sat in her apartment with her laptop open, 3 phones within reach, and a legal pad covered with strategic notes. She'd spent the afternoon conducting what she mentally termed reconnaissance calls, reaching out to former colleagues, industry contacts, and potential allies to gauge their willingness to support what was about to become a coordinated campaign. The first call was to Marcus Thompson. I was wondering when you'd piece it together, he said after she'd outlined what she'd discovered. I've been documenting Blackwood's pattern since my own forced retirement, but I needed someone with current access to confirm the details. You've been investigating this? Investigating, networking, and building a coalition of people who are tired of watching competent professionals get discarded in favor of cheaper alternatives. Marcus's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose patience was about to be rewarded. The question is whether you're ready to lead this fight, because it's going to require someone who can't be easily dismissed or discredited. What do you mean? I mean that I'm a 62-year-old former CTO who was forced into early retirement. They'll paint me as a disgruntled old-timer who can't adapt to modern business practices. You, on the other hand, are a 32-year-old systems architect who's currently saving their company from the consequences of their own incompetence. Becca understood immediately. Her position as an active consultant gave her credibility and leverage that other potential whistleblowers lacked. She wasn't a bitter former employee. She was a successful independent contractor who'd been proven right about the value of expertise. What kind of coalition are we talking about? Former employees with documented evidence of discriminatory practices, current employees who are willing to provide inside information, journalists who've been tracking similar patterns industry-wide, and attorneys who specialize in employment discrimination cases. The second call was to her brother Michael, whose labor rights practice had given him extensive experience with corporate discrimination cases. "Legally, you're in a strong position," he said, after reviewing the documentation she'd compiled. "The pattern is clear, the evidence is substantial, and your current consulting relationship actually strengthens your credibility. But you need to understand what you're getting into." Explain. Once this becomes public, InnovateTech will almost certainly terminate your consulting contract and probably attempt to discredit you professionally. They'll claim you're violating client confidentiality, that you're a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, that your allegations are motivated by financial gain. And how do we counter that? By being absolutely methodical about how we present the case. We need multiple corroborating witnesses, documentation that can't be disputed, and a narrative that focuses on the broader pattern rather than your personal situation. Michael paused, then continued in the tone he used when delivering difficult legal advice. "Becca, if we do this right, you'll probably end up with a significant financial settlement and industry recognition as someone who stood up to corporate discrimination. But if we do it wrong, you could find yourself blacklisted from major tech companies. And if we do nothing..." Blackwood continues his pattern at InnovateTech and eventually moves on to destroy another company's culture and another group of employees' careers. The third call was to Jennifer Walsh, the investigative journalist. "I've been hoping you'd call back," she said. "I've spent the past 3 days researching InnovateTech and Richard Blackwood's background. What I've found is consistent with a story I've been developing about systematic discrimination in Silicon Valley." "What kind of story?" "A comprehensive investigation into companies that use operational optimization as cover for discriminatory employment practices." InnovateTech would be a perfect case study, especially with your situation as a concrete example of how expertise gets devalued. Jennifer explained that she'd been tracking similar patterns at dozens of Bay Area companies, experienced employees being systematically replaced by cheaper alternatives, with women and older workers disproportionately affected. The problem is that most victims are bound by non-disclosure agreements or too afraid of retaliation to speak publicly. You're in a unique position because you're currently working as an independent consultant, which gives you both credibility and legal protection. What would you need from me? Access to the documentation you've compiled, interviews with you and other affected employees, and permission to use InnovateTech as a detailed case study. In return, I can guarantee that the story will be thoroughly researched, legally vetted, and positioned to create maximum impact on industry practices. The fourth call was the most difficult, Amanda Phillips. "I was wondering if you'd figure it out," Amanda said after Becca had carefully outlined what she'd discovered. "I've been losing sleep over this situation for months." "Amanda, I need to ask you directly. Are you willing to provide documentation about InnovateTech's employment practices?" There was a long silence before Amanda responded. "If I do this, I'm probably ending my career at InnovateTech. If you don't do this, how many more employees are going to lose their careers because of Blackwood's practices?" Another pause. "What kind of documentation are you looking for?" "HR records showing the pattern of terminations, any communications discussing cost optimization strategies, performance reviews that were modified to justify firings, and anything else that demonstrates systematic discrimination. I can provide most of that, Amanda said quietly. But I need some kind of protection. I can't just hand over confidential HR files without legal safeguards. My brother is an employment attorney. He can structure this so that you're protected. As a whistleblower under federal law. Give me 24 hours to think about it, Amanda said. This is a big decision. After the calls were finished, Becca created a detailed project plan that would have impressed any systems architect. She had her core team, Marcus providing industry credibility and connections, Michael handling legal strategy, Jennifer managing media exposure, and potentially Amanda providing insider documentation. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Present InnovateTech's discriminatory practices as part of a broader industry problem. Use multiple sources to corroborate the evidence and position the story as an investigation into corporate ethics rather than personal revenge. Her phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. Jake just spent 3 hours trying to fix a problem that you would have solved in 10 minutes. Blackwood is starting to ask uncomfortable questions about system reliability. Becca smiled as she typed, Back. The education continues. But her amusement was tempered by the weight of what she was about to undertake. Tomorrow, she would continue her consulting work at InnovateTech, maintaining the professional facade while gathering the final pieces of evidence needed to expose their discriminatory practices. She was no longer just Rebecca Harper, the undervalued systems architect seeking personal vindication. She was becoming the leader of a coordinated effort to challenge systematic discrimination in the tech industry. The irony wasn't lost on her. InnovateTech had fired her to save money and reduce complications. Instead, they'd created someone with the expertise, motivation, and platform needed to expose their unethical practices to the entire industry. As she prepared for bed, Becca reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 6 weeks. She'd gone from dedicated employee to independent consultant to potential whistleblower, each transformation expanding her understanding of her own capabilities and the systemic problems she was positioned to address. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, for the first time since her termination, Rebecca Harper felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The catastrophic failure began at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 4 days before Becca had planned to finalize her whistleblower documentation. She was awakened by her phone buzzing incessantly. First Jake's panicked calls, then Amanda Phillips, then even Blackwood himself as InnovateTech's entire infrastructure began collapsing like dominoes. Everything's failing, Jake's voice cracked. Through the phone. Peterson Group, Morrison Industries, even our internal systems. I don't know what's happening. Becca arrived at InnovateTech to find absolute chaos. Clients were threatening lawsuits, servers were melting down, and Jake had suffered what appeared to be a complete breakdown. Blackwood cornered her in the lobby, his usual arrogance replaced by desperation. Name your price, he said. Full reinstatement, equity, whatever you want. Just save us. I'll consider it, Becca replied calmly. But my terms have changed significantly since this morning. 6 months later, InnovateTech had been fundamentally transformed. Becca returned as Chief Technology Officer, working alongside Marcus as CEO and Amanda as reformed HR Director. Jennifer Walsh's exposé had triggered industry-wide discussions about discrimination, leading to policy changes across Silicon Valley. Jake, humbled by his experience, was completing additional training under Becca's mentorship. At a tech conference, Becca delivered a keynote about valuing expertise over politics. True architecture, she concluded, isn't just about systems, it's about building organizations that recognize and nurture human potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.